My name is Sani Mojola. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and the School of Public and International Affairs. And it's also my honor to serve as the director of the Office of Population Research, OPR, comprised of an extraordinary set of colleagues, staff, and students. So today we begin a series of discussions about major topics facing world populations. And we're excited to begin with a panel on climate change and population dynamics. Later in the fall, we're going to have a panel on 8 billion people. In our panels, we aim to bring together some of the nation's best demographers and other academics, along with some of the nation's most prominent writers and thinkers to engage them. I want to thank Professor Feliz Garib, along with Nancy Kanuli and Shannon Peck, for their hard work organizing today's panel. So let me introduce the panel and speakers. So these days, the word climate change is charged. But whatever disagreements, political and otherwise exist, it's hard to argue with the on-the-ground realities faced by everyday Americans and everyday human beings. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, this year, 2023, is the worst year on record for billion-dollar-plus events in the US. And the year's not even over. They count 23 such disasters between January and August, including 18 severe weather events, 2 major flooding events, a major hurricane, a major wildfire, and a major winter storm. In total, they've contributed to almost $58 billion in damage, and even greater damage in the form of lives lost, livelihoods destroyed, and neighborhoods and communities torn apart. And that's just in the United States, a country with the resources to aid restoration and repair. But when we look around the world, in my home continent of Africa, for example, the WHO reports that in May, over 400,000 people, just in May, were displaced in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya as a result of drought and flooding. And almost 60 million are dealing with food insecurity as a result of the crisis. There were deadly floods in India and Pakistan, and just recently, Libya. I could go on and on and on. Climate change is not just linked to extreme weather events, but also shifting patterns in disease and in ecosystems. It contributes to population dynamics that are at the core of demographic research, such as decisions to move or stay, decisions about whether to have children, and it can shape quite literally whether, where, and how people live and die. Climate change is truly the big question of our time. And here to help us think through it, we have a wonderful panel of speakers who I'll introduce next. So David Wallace Wells is a journalist who writes for the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, and The Guardian. Trained at Brown University, he's also been a National Fellow at the New America Foundation. His magisterial, trenchant, and really, frankly, scary essay, Uninhabitable Earth, published in 2017 in New York, was the most read article in that magazine's history. He published a subsequent book in 2019 by the same title, which was one of Time Magazine's 100 most read books that year. And it was also the 100 notable books list of the New York Times in 2019. Mr. Wallace Wells' writing on climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic is critical and thought-provoking. And I think his voice is truly a clarion call for a generation whose very existence and futures are threatened, not just here in the United States, but also around the world. Mr. Wallace Wells, welcome. Dr. Charla Osden, Charla Osden is lead economist in the Development Research Group of the World Bank and co-director of this year's 2023 World Development Report. Trained in economics at Stanford, he's a fellow of the Institute of Labor Economics, at the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration, and the Economic Research Forum. His research explores the nexus of globalization, of product and labor markets, government policy, and economic developments. In addition to editing 3 books, publishing many papers in journals such as American Economic Review, he's also the lead author of a flagship report, Moving for Prosperity, Global Migration and Labor Markets. His current research, in addition to the mammoth task of directing the World Development Report, is focused on determinants and patterns of global labor mobility, the impact of migrants on destination labor market outcomes, and the medical brain drain, among other topics. Dr. Osden, welcome. Michael Oppenheimer is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Geosciences and International Affairs, as well as the High Meadows Environmental Institute here at Princeton. He's also the Faculty Director of the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment, or CPRE, and Faculty Associate of the Atmospheric and Ocean Sciences Program. He trained in chemical physics at the University of Chicago, go University of Chicago. And before coming to Princeton in 2002, he was the chief scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund. Among his many awards and honors, he's won the Guggenheim and Heinz Awards, is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's also the editor-in-chief of Climate Change Letters, co-editor-in-chief of Climatic Change. Professor Oppenheimer has also served in several national and international capacities, such as on the EPA, NASA, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a true giant in the field. Professor Oppenheimer, welcome. Jess Metcalf is the new professor. She just became a professor today. I think we have to She's a professor of ecology, evolutionary biology, and public affairs, as well as a faculty affiliate at the Office of Population Research here at Princeton. She trained at Oxford and Imperial College London and collaborated with a range of other institutions, including the Max Planck in Germany, Penn State, and Duke. Professor Metcalf's work is especially distinctive for its scale and breadth and has been praised multiple times in Nature and Science. And since 2020, she's been on the board of reviewing editors for Science. It's hard to know quite how to characterize her groundbreaking work. She's a demographer of plants, the focus of her PhD, but she's also a demographer of creatures, examining and modeling the behavior of pathogens and fruit bats, as well as a demographer and epidemiologist of people, examining epidemics such as measles, malaria, rubella, as well as COVID-19. Her current work examines what she calls landscapes of immunity, how to predict the next pandemics, as well as how to make better use of vaccinations to prevent human suffering. Professor Metcalf, welcome. Finally, last but not least, Feliz Garif is Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs here at Princeton, as well as a faculty affiliate at the Office of Population Research. After full professorships at Harvard and Cornell, he decided that Princeton was the best, and considered sharing the academic efforts with extraordinary with us. A multi-award-winning work recognized in a range of disciplines such as political science, international studies, as well as sociology, has pushed substantive and methodological boundaries in areas such as migration, climate change, and computational social science and machine learning. Among her many honors and awards, she's been elected into the Sociological Research Association and won the Rami Koch Medal of Science. Her current research examines how climate change shapes migration decisions and its consequences for life and death outcomes among migrants along the US-Mexico border. Professor Garib organized this fantastic panel and will serve as its moderator. Professor Garib, welcome. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Hi, I'm David Wallace-Wells. I'm really grateful to be here, but mostly I'm feeling humbled to be here, humbled to be a part of this panel, and especially to be leading it off. So I thought, because of how impressed I am with the other participants, what I could do myself is to talk a little bit, less about climate change narrowly, and maybe more a little bit about what is sometimes called, storytelling or narrative, or maybe more broadly, how we think about the future, how we think about these issues. I'm sure my fellow panelists will fill in some more detail with their own expertise, but from where I come from, wanted to sort of frame things for all of us in the biggest picture. And when I do that, the thing that I think is most important to emphasize right now, at least, is uncertainty and complexity. When we're thinking about all of these stories unfolding together over decades, it feels to me increasingly too simplistic to tell, narrow stories, or point to particular pathways and feel confident that they are, showing us exactly the way that the world will unfold. When we're talking about climate dynamics, when we're talking about political dynamics, economic dynamics, population dynamics, all of these are unbelievably difficult to project. And I think we sometimes fall into a trap of simplification in telling those stories about the future. But I may be telling my own story more than the story of the world there. I'm somebody who a few years ago, when I was really starting to work most seriously on climate, spent a lot of time looking at charts, spent a lot of time looking at graphs, and felt like I was seeing not just the story of the past, but really the future, and in some great detail and clarity. And those charts I was looking at, I was looking at, charts of carbon emissions, which were going up every year very reliably. Some of those charts were annotated with like the dates of all these conferences that didn't seem to disturb the trajectory of carbon emissions. I was looking at charts of carbon concentrations, which had pulled the planet well outside the experience of the human species into some unprecedented territory. And I was looking similarly at charts and graphs of global temperature rise, which told the same story. We are already now outside the window of temperatures that enclose the entire history of human civilization. And what that meant, to me at least a few years ago, was, I think it's still true, that we are in the middle of an incredible and really quite risky experiment here. But I also, all of these charts were like charting the path up a mountain peak, and we were in all of them at the highest point. And then there was another set of charts that drew lines down. Some of them drew lines down to net zero very rapidly. Some of them drew lines to decarbonization that would take several decades. Some of them told much scarier stories about the future in which all of these growth patterns continue to grow and the changes to the climate continue to grow too. And I felt at the time that, the future was going to be about which of those pathways forward we took, what choices we made to get us on which trajectory, which brought us to which endgame. And, the truth is, I just think these days that the story is much more honestly told without those future charts and those future pathways, just with the first set of graphs, which show where we are, where we came from, what an unprecedented situation we're in, and really how much of what we've taken for granted about human life and the planet is no longer true, or certainly can be counted on in a sort of ongoing way. And, that's not to say that if we are orienting ourselves with regard to the future through uncertainty, it's not to say that we know nothing. It's not to say that we're living in ignorance. We know quite a lot. Among other things, we know that what used to be thought of as best case climate scenarios are no longer possible. It may mean that some worst case scenarios that we used to fear are also not possible. And it may mean that we have a relatively good sense of actually the likely range of climate futures that our children and grandchildren will be living in. It may mean that. But what even that narrower band of certainty tells us about how disrupted the future will be is really quite disorienting. If we land on the trajectories that seem possible now, maybe we'll end up with about twice as much warming as we have today, maybe a little bit less, but somewhere probably in that range. And as I'm sure Michael can tell us in a little bit more detail, that can mean things like things that used to be 100-year flood events happening in much of the world every single year. It can mean that heat waves that are lethal to some parts of the population would become much more regular in some very densely populated parts of the world, such that, it's been estimated that if a power outage hit Phoenix during a heat wave, you could literally see something like half of the city's population in the hospital. And the fires in Canada that we're seeing this season, I think, also tell a quite grim story about even a moderate climate future. These are fires that are about they burned about twice as much area as any previous year in modern Canadian history. They've released more carbon into the atmosphere than all of the Canadian economy has. And we don't quite know exactly how common they will be over the next few decades, but the trajectory is looking quite difficult. And I think that's the big meta story climate change is remaking the planet. It is pushing us farther away from everything we used to know and take for granted about the way that the natural world worked and how we interacted with it. Not to say that we had reached a perfect and happy equilibrium in how we interacted with the planet, but we thought we knew some things about, how often floods were coming and what fires were like. And we're entering into a phase in which we know a lot less. And our basic intuitions about that we've imported from the recent past are much less relevant than they used to be. That's not necessarily an apocalyptic kind of scenario. All of these impacts and changes are quite significant, but ultimately I think it's also important to remember they only form the landscape on which the human future will be built. And there are many, many choices that we can make as individuals collectively to build different kinds of future, even on a much more jagged, much more ragged climate. But I also don't know exactly what kinds of choices we will be making. And I don't say that just about our politics and our policy, just pointing us in two different directions at once. I was just saying a few minutes ago, when the US signed the Paris Agreement, or when we reached the Paris Accord in 2015, there was a ban on American oil exports, and we were basically exporting no natural gas. Now we are the world's fourth largest exporter of oil. We're the world's largest consumer of oil, and we are the world's largest producer and exporter of natural gas. Even as we're also celebrating something like the IRA, which pushes us into a totally different renewable energy future. So at the policy level, things are pointing in multiple directions, but all the way down to the individual level, things are pointing in multiple directions as well. We hear about increasing climate risk and climate hazard, and yet we see populations actually growing in many parts of the world where those risks are growing. Now, that's not to say that all those people are foolish or that they have a death drive or they're climate ignorant or any of that. It's just to say that the story of migration, population growth, even when viewed narrowly through the climate lens, is a very complicated one, which we have some intuitions about how things may unfold and be reshaped in the decades ahead, but they are really just intuitions. And we're going to be feeling our way forward without much historical, climate or environmental, or for that matter, political precedent for many decades. And I think that is the main overarching theme that I would like to sort of start with today, especially leading off this great panel, is just to say, we're talking about the future, we're talking about these dynamics. I think the most important thing is, on some level, to remain in a kind of awe about how different the world that we're talking about really will look like, even if it conforms to many of the predictions and projections that we think are strongest. There are going to be an enormous set of things that surprise us. And just to return at the end to my own experience and underline that point, I mean, someone mentioned my book a few minutes ago, published that book in 2019. It was not that long ago. And yet, in the interim, we've had the rise of a global climate political movement. We've had a total transformation of expectation for decarbonization. Remains to be seen exactly how much we will fulfill that promise, but we are now having, among other things, like a national labor strike about the future of EV vehicles and labor. It's like 5 years ago, people weren't saying the auto industry is going to be completely disrupted in the space of 2 or 3 years. We need to develop new labor regulations around that. The fact that we're doing that now is just one small reminder of how much things have changed around climate. But we've also had a pandemic. We've also changed our perspective on the future of China and how much that was going to dominate the 21st century. We're starting to think about what the arrival, if it is an arrival, of AI means for all of these things. I mean, this is just in the space of a few years. And all of these dynamics make that future, much more interesting, but also much messier than at least I would have told you, telling the same story up here 5 years ago and plotting a very neat linear path towards, either an optimistic or pessimistic future. So with that, I'll leave it to the next panelists and look forward to all your remarks and then talking to everybody in the room together.
So thank you, David. That's actually a really good introduction to what I was going to say. And by the way, I gave what I had planned to be the talk I was going to give today. I gave it 2 weeks ago, and I know there were some people in the audience who were there. I apologize for that. I fell victim to what happens to most academics. That is, you learn how to do something and to say something, and then you say it again, and you say it again, and you say it again until you yourself fall down in a super boredom from yourself. But David's framing of this, I think, is exactly right. I think, in fact, I said when I gave this talk 2 weeks ago, is it's a mess. The world is always a mess, actually, if you look historically. So what's new? There is a lot new. It's whatever it is, it's happening faster. There are probably a lot of more decision pathways that we have to follow. And whether you think this is all going to wind up okay or not okay, depends on whether you're dispositionally an optimist or a pessimist. I don't think you can reach a logical conclusion. It's a matter of, you know, how you feel about the world and what your expectations are. And so, you know, we're passing this on to the younger people here, and you got to live with it. But it's not that different in some ways from what other generations have had to live with. I have to live with being clumsy with moving the PowerPoint. Let's see if I can do it effectively. There we go. Okay. I'm going to focus on an aspect of the problem that hasn't been focused on a lot. That is, given this frame that David gave us, how do we adjust to it? How do we adapt to it? How do we take hold of it and turn it to our own purposes rather than just living with all this stuff coming down on us from the climate? As opposed to the talk I gave a couple of weeks ago, which was supposed to be 12 minutes long and was, in fact, 18 or 19 minutes long by the time I got done. And today we've been given 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do, which may be I may regret, or you may regret, is I'm going to assume you actually know a lot about the climate problem. And if you don't and you have questions afterwards, you can ask me, or you can look it up in some book somewhere. But I'm going to start in the middle, and you have to live with it. So and just to cite this at the last minute. So, okay, the world is warming. We know that. We know it's warming mostly at the high latitudes. We know the warming is occurring at a record pace, at least in terms of the last few thousand years. We know that sea level is rising. We know that sea level is accelerating in the upward direction, and that it's the current rate of rise of that order of magnitude greater than would happen over the last couple of millennia and higher than over the last century. We also know that humans are starting to experience this in a way that is definitely due to climate change. This is a graph of, on the left side, the number of days per year that communities along the U.S. coast suffer from what's called alternatively sunny day flooding or nuisance flooding. It's basically due to the high tide. As the sea level rises, the highest tides go up, and more areas inland get flooded. The states that are along the coastal labels on the bottom, from Rhode Island going to Hawaii, and the year is the remaining axis. And what it shows is back in 1950, there were very few days of this kind of nuisance flooding, but more recently in the 2010s, the amount of such days have gone up by an order of magnitude. People know this, they feel this, most of them don't know it has to do with sea level rise, but it costs money, and it's something that people are starting to try to adjust to, for instance, in Miami by improving the pumping systems. Okay, these are the projections of future warming that David talked about. It's spaghetti charts. I'm not going to show it to you any more than that. This is the projection of future sea level. We have basically, we're able to project sea level rise pretty reliably through about mid-century, and then I won't say we don't know what the hell's going on. I will say the uncertainties grow large. We're in an area of what's called ambiguity. That is, scientists disagree, or some of them just say we don't know at all. But it's important to know that sea level is going to rise a lot in the historical context. We know that precipitation is going to change. The brown areas are going to get less precipitation. The blue areas are going to get more precipitation. But in a warming world, we don't care so much about the amount of precipitation necessarily. One of the things we care about is usable water. The warming leads to more evaporation. So even in some areas that get more precipitation, they'll be drier in terms of water for agriculture or water for drinking. So it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily do them any good. Now we're going to get to the point which David made for me, but I'm going to make it again. Because we did a lot of work on this here as part of an IPCC report that I was an author on. And that is, as sea level rises, it's not the average that matters that much, although it does matter to people that are right along the coast. It's also the extreme. When sea level gets to be a real problem, sea level rise is during a storm or a king tide. And at that point, sea level can rise enough episodically so that a flood level, as David so articulately stole my thunder, said that previously might have occurred once a century is going to occur by mid-century in a lot of places on the global coast, not just the US, but including the US, once a year. Once a century becomes once a year. A once a century flood is damn hard to deal with. In some places, it's catastrophic today. Some places it can be managed okay. But what about a once in 300-year flood? We don't know how to deal with those. Hurricane Sandy in this neighborhood was a once in 300-year flood, roughly. We're still recovering from Hurricane Sandy. In the areas that were damaged, they're not in some aspects, they're not really near recovery. The recovery is going to go on for another decade or two because it's so expensive to rebuild. It's so expensive to rebuild better so it doesn't happen again. So that's one number to keep in your head. How do you deal with extreme events coming more and more frequently while it's not clear that we can improve the rate of build back any quicker than we do now? We'll probably get better at it, but will we get so much better that we'll be able to create a space for ourselves between these extreme events so that we won't just recover from them, but we'll get our economies and our people back in a condition so that they have some breathing room before the next extreme event comes along. And to me, the most risky part of this problem is that space between extreme events, not only because heat waves are because sea level is causing high water levels on the coast to be more frequent, but because heavy precipitation is causing inland flooding events that are intended to become more frequent, because heat waves are becoming more frequent. In this case, heat wave that occurred once a decade back in pre-industrial times, it occurs about 5 times more frequently already, that same heat wave with a given intensity. And then by sort of toward the end of the century in the worst projections, it occurs 39 times more frequently. That is, that was the 50-year event, not the once a decade event. In other words, an event which today is twice a century is almost once a year by the end of the century. How do we deal with that? Well, you have to look at how we deal with such things today. And the answer is we don't deal with them very well. This, by the way, is to show the distributional consequences of these sorts of changes. The biggest effect of extreme heat is going to occur in the places that are already too hot. These are the number of days per year when statistically you'll be able to determine excess deaths that are attributable to the warming. The brown or red or deep red colors are the places which have the highest change in excess deaths. And you'll notice it's basically countries that are at the lower latitudes, most of which don't have the capability, the resources, at least today, to adjust to that kind of change. This is the best piece of journalism I've seen on this was actually the Washington Post. Sorry, David, you probably it was based largely on a paper by Tamara Carlton of UCSB and a bunch of econometric colleagues. And what we see here is there are a lot of messages in this. I'll just get a couple of them. First of all, the green circles are countries that see a decrease in climate and heat-related mortality in the future because they're a little too cool right now. And you can reduce the number of excess deaths by making them warmer. The purple ones are the ones that are a little too warm right now. And when you make them yet hotter, it's a U-shaped curve, they start experiencing increased mortality. So again, And by the way, the size of the circle has to do with is GDP per capita. So the poorer countries that are at the lower latitudes are the ones that get stuck with the damage that, as has been said many times, are caused by the countries north, so-called global north. The global north are the countries that are green largely, this is a generalization, and they wind up actually being better off just due to this narrow part of the climate problem, not in general, due to the change in temperature related mortality. So the distributional issues are the ones you always have to keep in mind. Now, how do we deal with this? How do the United States and other countries deal with this increase in risk that is already, as those graphs show you, started to manifest itself? Well, this is how we deal with it. One of the richest parts of the world, Hurricane Sandy, 2012, lower part of Manhattan. You see a few lights. Those are places that had their own generators, but basically, lower part of Manhattan was wiped out electrically for 4 days. Why did that happen? It happened because a substation of Con Ed sitting along the East River was not sufficiently defended against flooding. A, it shouldn't have been sitting along the river. B, if it was sitting along the river, they should have built a wall that was big enough to keep. You don't build it to the last flood that happens. You look forward a little bit. And they knew sea level was rising, so they knew the risk would increase. But they did nothing. And what happened? You got that. Billions of dollars, whoosh, evaporated right there. There's Hurricane Ida also. I've got a picture from New York City, but it came through this part of the world as a subtropical depression. And it carried an incredible amount of precipitation in very intense bursts. And it flooded a lot of the cities along the East Coast and inland. And a bunch of people in New York were drowned in their beds, essentially. That's an image that I can't get out of my head, frankly. Why did that happen? They shouldn't have been undefended, unprotected habitation essentially below ground level. Why were they in basement apartments? It's a violation of the city code. It's because the city hasn't been enforcing the code. Why haven't they been enforcing the code? Because there are other problems. They have a huge and oddly growing population, have had it for about the last 15 or 20 years, unanticipated. If you went back to 1970, the population in New York City was shrinking. Where did they put all those people? Again, we have that sort of same drama going on today with the refugee crisis that's happening in New York City. But you got to put people somewhere. And one of the places you put them is by letting them live in habitation which is substandard and where their lives are at risk. Again, this was known to be a problem. It's known that the city drainage system can't handle the water. They can't face the multi-billion-dollar costs. So basically they did nothing about it. And then the Lahaina fires, the stories are just starting to come out about what wasn't done, even though the risk was anticipated. And I can show you pictures like this from around the world. Bad event, risk anticipated, like the floods in Germany in 2021, like what just happened in Libya again and again and again. And it isn't just climate change interacting with something else, including the failure of human beings to really think about problems in advance. This is not new. The North Sea flood in the UK and the Netherlands in 1953 are the reason why the Netherlands now have such a modern system of coastal defense. They are the reason that the UK built the Thames Barrier. But why did they wait that long? Why did they wait for disaster? There's always a reason. World War I, World War II, and a depression and a lot of other bad stuff. But that's always going to happen. That's your point. There's this context which is always going to throw up problems. Climate change isn't the only one. And how do we react? How do we prepare when we're not even keeping up today and where the drumbeat is going to just accelerate? So why are we in this shape? Well, it used to be that these episodes were infrequent. A 100-year event would occur every 100 years. That's not true anymore. And so because they were infrequent, And because human memories are short, people are myopic, and the governments are myopic, we just toss something away after it's, after you're looking at it in the rear view mirror. You remember it for a while, everybody gets excited after a bad event, they try to do something about it, but that willpower and the financing that goes along with it does not last. And the willpower drains away, some other thing, like a war or depression, comes in the way, political attention is diverted. So the planning times are long, the time scale of an election cycle is a very common thing that we're familiar with, which diverts attention or gains attention on some problems, and then the attention goes away. People who are governing us live by that cycle. That gets in the way of solving problems which are long-term, and the fact that people forget about the worst part of it, they don't put the pressure on their leaders, is the other part of that equation. People have different levels of information. Some people don't, 30% of the US population thinks I'm lying right now. Okay, that tells you a lot. Even if they get the right information, they don't listen to it necessarily. And a big problem, country by country, a lot of the so-called climate adaptation system is really an emergency response system that's been retread, and that will not work. We need something entirely different. The US in particular suffers that problem because most of the money raising through tax revenues at the federal level, a lot of the responsibility for the adaptation is at the local and state level. And there is no attempt right now yet, just some minor changes in the way revenue is shared to bridge that gap. And that's one of many things that needs to be done. So what does that mean to me about the future? Well, we can, if we have enough money, we can be doing things like building the protection around New Orleans, which we built. And then of course that wasn't good enough. That was built to defend against Hurricane Betsy, and due to a combination of incompetence, corruption, and not quite enough money, it collapsed when Hurricane Katrina came along. So we're doing it again, but this defense isn't good beyond a category 4. We're bound to get a category 5 one of these days. We don't know what the surge will be, but it's something to worry about. And anyway, most of the world can't afford now, and in 30 years won't be able to afford doing that. We can afford it maybe up to a point, but even this rich country can't do it everywhere. There is the low-hanging fruit, like the success story in Bangladesh of building an early warning system and coordinating that eventually with building concrete bunkers so that the death rates in cyclones on the Bay of Bengal has gone down from many 100,000 to a few thousand. A few thousand, still a lot of dead people, but it's a hell of a lot better than 500,000 dead people, which is what happened in 1970. And then there's so that's something that, we ought to at least get on the obvious things, like building walls to defend substations that we started out with. And then there's the living with the climate problem. I mean, I think this is going to call for a transformation where we're willing to do, that's Cambodia, what people have done in some places all the time. They learn how to live with problems like flooding in a better way. They learn how to build or adjust their cities so they're not quite as nasty hot as they are. Cities are, at 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer or whatever the number is globally. And so we have a choice, and the choice is some combination of all three of these. And as David said, we can't really map it out from here, but we can at least start thinking about it and start making the changes that are relatively easy. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Michael said he's reciting his presentations and what he presented 2 weeks ago and so on and so forth. My case is worse because I gave a similar talk this morning in this room. And half the audience is, I think, the same. So I'm going to try to perform this mental exercise, forget what you heard this morning. So I'm going to give it a shot. So I'm in the research department of the World Bank, and up until 18 months ago, I had a fantastic life. I wrote my academic papers. My wife is a professor. And I had the life she was envious of because I get to write papers, do research without having to teach. And I'm sure some of you feel the same way. But then it got interrupted with the WDR. They said you have to pay your taxes to the institution and co-lead the WDR. So WDR does this, thinking on how do we approach a development challenge where there's a lot of debate, uncertainty, polarized thinking, fight, arguments, you name it. So that's what we did. We tried. And the best part of the WDR, it actually forced me out of my comfort zone. I work on labor mobility and the impact of labor mobility on development, especially labor market outcomes in both origin and destination countries. And I look at issues of brain drain, so on and so forth. So I had to look at all these other dimensions of mobility, which was fantastic. I learned a lot, and climate change is one of them, because you hear about the linkage between climate change and migration all the time. And then I was curious about it. So we had the WDR come out, and during this process, I learned a couple of things. But Michael said, 30% of the US, they don't believe him. When you're titled, you have the World Bank there, that goes up significantly higher across the world because they think you have some hidden agenda. So I am telling the truth, I swear to God. So please, now what we taught, so this is the cover of the WDR. I said this morning, I'm going to say it again for those who aren't. Please go check it, log in online. Your downloads impact my annual evaluation and grades. I talked about the demographics, and these are, so I deal with demography a lot. I deal with income changes. So those forces actually are measured quite precisely, especially demography, right? We have a pretty good idea. I mean, the confidence intervals in the statistical sense are pretty narrow. What will the population dynamics will be over the next 30, 40, 50 years, right? Especially in terms of labor markets. We know more or less the education levels of the people. There might be some endogeneity and behavioral adaptation, but we do know the number of people because we have a very good idea. UN Population Division does not have a good idea about fertility rates because they kind of overestimate it. But nevertheless, we have a pretty good idea about the labor market size for the next 50 years, right? I knew about it. Everybody knows about it. So that was the easy part. Conflict and violence, it is unknown, but it's like earthquakes in a way, right? We know it's going to happen. And we have ways of kind of dealing with it. It just takes money, believe it or not. I mean, this is maybe a crude way of saying it. How do we deal with the aftermath of conflict and violence, and the human toll can be something that we have. But after it happens, the estimates of the cost of rebuilding Syria, it's not, for example, the actual cost of building infrastructure, it's the human cost, right? But the physical cost, we have a pretty good idea. But when it came to climate change, what I have learned, I mean, and both David and Michael mentioned it, is the unknowns, right? Now, I want to emphasize something. The way I saw it when I started reading this and talking to climate scientists is, did I already talk too much? Okay. So, anyway, the unknown is not on the science part. That actually we have a much better idea. I mean, those graphs, they show the trajectories, we have a pretty good idea. It is the human impact, especially the impact on human mobility, we have no clue. This is what some economists call the unknown unknowns. Now, this is a criticism of the economics profession, because economists are pretty good at estimating, looking at past data, right? We hit the functions, we are especially great with linear regressions, right? But and even the non-linear ones, but we're good with continuous functions, estimating fitting the line. But the climate event is a discontinuous event. It's a very disruptive event because let's go back. We look at there's some climate event, some region, and it operates through most of the time through the declines in region, right? It affects, for example, the productivity rate in field agriculture productivity rate, the incomes decline and people move. And we have a pretty good idea on predicting how people can adapt. And most of the adaptation historically has been you move to another part because they have relatively small areas and relatively the habitability, it affects certain places, but it's much bigger deal, for example, with let's say That was relatively rare. So when we run regressions, our famous regressions looking at the impact of climate change on mobility, you don't actually get any result because it operates through the declines of income. Right? When you control for it, you have some sort of idea. But what will climate change do is an impact this. Right? And that's a kind of a non-linear event. Right? That's the first thing I want to emphasize. You think the climate change trajectories are unknown. How the humans are going to react, how they're going to adapt is completely unknown because we have, and this is a shortcoming of the economics profession, because we never had past data to form our models and make the predictions, because we also don't know how humans are going to adjust, right? If some big flooding happens in Liberia or in Bangladesh, where will people go? Because nothing of that scale that might happen has ever happened. Right? It's not even a 1 year, like every 100-year event. So that's the shortcoming where there is that knowledge gap there. Now there are all these studies which say, oh, there are going to be 500 million climate refugees. Now take that with a grain of salt, right? Because if you look at the underlying science of that, it's much more advocacy than actually scientific research. To be honest, that's take that, forget that for a second. Now, so this is the first thing. I mean, this is a kind of a I want to emphasize shortcoming of the economics profession. Sorry, we don't know, right? If somebody says we have a pretty good model, how people are going to move, and well, no, it's not true. But that doesn't mean something disastrous cannot happen. It's just we need much more data, and we need different ways of thinking and modeling and estimating these impacts. The second thing I want to emphasize is completely different. I talked about this morning, so I'm going to say it again. And it's the following. This is, for me, was the most important picture from the WDR. Most important. This is what we say, how poverty is spread out. Sorry for it. It wasn't my fault. Is apparently a colorful format for the WDR that you stuck with it. I would have chosen different colors, so it doesn't come out as strong. The original versions were much better. And this is the fertility. The WDR talks way more about the changes in the fertility behavior and the aging versus the young populations, and where the problem in the world is not the total number of people. It is the unevenness of the age distribution across different geographies and income levels, and even within the city. That's the problem. And here, again, it's a low-income country problem. It's just that most of these low-income countries happen to be in sub-Saharan. State fragility, right? Of course, we have Afghanistan there, and we have Iraq and Syria, but it is a sub-Saharan problem. This is a kind of taking all these other factors. This is not what happened in the past with projections. And climate vulnerability. Climate vulnerability, this takes into account kind of response mechanisms. What I want to emphasize, this is really fundamental, but should stick with you, that these are the same maps. If you take a kind of a correlation, it is extremely high. So the same countries in the world and the same regions in the same countries of the world are going to be impacted by the same shocks. So this implies, from a development perspective, and this is the fundamental development challenge of the World Bank and of academics and the policymakers and the Gates Foundation, you name it, is you cannot attack each one separately. Right? Any development program has to attack them simultaneously. Okay? Because they are reinforcing each other. There's some sort of this endogeneity. And any other policy, when this is part of the problem at the World Bank, I noticed, because we have different units on each subject. So when for example, the climate people talk about it, they actually, they don't talk to the demographers. And we have actually social protection and labor units. They know nothing about climate change, but this map was meant to say, look, you have to do this together. But this links to population movements, right? This is the why it is hard when you say there's a climate event, people are moving up. But I don't know if it is just because of climate event, but climate event led to some sort of conflict and violence and people are moving out, or relate to decrease in income levels. Right? That linkages are, from an academic perspective, needs identification and proper address, but from a policy angle as well. And that's also, despite all the knowledge we have on development, and we have tons of data and all that stuff, there are very few studies which can identify the causal mechanisms. The correlation is very straightforward, but the causal mechanisms is very difficult. And once you don't have the causal identification of the causal mechanisms, how you respond to that is not straightforward. And hence, this leads to population movements. Right? In some ways, population movement is a response mechanism. It's great, right? When there's poverty, when there's disaster, enabling people to move actually reduces the welfare cost of whatever disaster we're talking about. It's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster. It enables us to respond to it. And the current policy environment where, we're actually even making it difficult for professors to get visas in the United States tells you something about the extent of the policy space. So the gaps in our knowledge is there. So this, I wanted to, end with that, where, because it's an academic audience, where your energy should be targeting is basically not only the endogenous linkages, but the endogenous responsibilities. For example, there are some initial papers in economics where you have even minute productivity improvements, right? For whatever reason, and the outcomes change considerably. And a lot of the existing economic models or demographic models, for example, don't take that into account. So these things have to be part of the formal models. But the more important is we are on this planet together. We have to, this is hard to say. Some of the messages that came out of the G20 meetings was quite promising in that sense, but we never know. It's the politicians talking. Remember, mobility is a good thing. It is a symptom, but it is also an adaptation and response mechanism. Right? We shouldn't instantly have this negative thing or environmental refugee, but it is how we deal with this stuff. Oops. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
So, on top of all those cheerful topics, we now do infectious diseases. And to understand how climate change will shape infectious diseases, obviously we first need to understand how climate drivers shape the transmission of infections. And this might be, if it's a directly transmitted infection, the temperature of the air, the dryness, its coldness can shape how particles move through the air. If you're thinking about environmentally transmitted infections like cholera or typhoid, clearly flooding will be a concern. If you're thinking about anything transmitted by a vector, it's obvious that climate drivers can shape vector ecology. But this is only half the story. These direct effects are meaningless if you do not consider the human element, as I think everyone on this panel has so far mentioned. Everything from seasonal patterns of human migration to just the fact that in cold temperatures we tend to aggregate indoors, to disruptions to our healthcare systems or climate migrants will shape the transmission of infections. So I'm going to organize this around 4 themes. So the first is biological limits. And this echoes something that Michael was saying, is if you think about most pathogens, there tends to be some sort of intermediate optimal to where they live, right? Like if you imagine a mosquito, it could be temperatures where it's too cold for them to live. As they increase, as the temperature increases, they might develop faster, but it becomes a temperature that's just too hot for them. So if you know something about these mechanisms, and we biologists know mechanisms, but economists do not, then you can start predicting what you expect to happen in particular places. So if you live in a place at this temperature, obviously an increase in temperature is bad, but if you live in a place at the other scale, it could be good in terms of reduction of infectious diseases. And you can put these pieces together to translate into expected transmission in future climates. And so this is some work by James Caldwell, who's a member of the group, looking at where we expect Zika to have been in the past and in the future, for example. But this is incomplete because you just can't think about these things without thinking about people, and people are incredibly difficult. And also because there's lots of uncertainty. Actually, I was blind about the mechanisms and our understanding of them. This is what you understand about a mosquito if you keep it in a very constrained lab environment. and you say, okay, I'm going to make you so hot that you die, out in the wild, the mosquito is probably going to fly under a leaf. This is information I have from Ben, who works on this. So there's the biological limits. There's also the disruption of healthcare and human systems we must consider. This is Madagascar, which has been hit by just a huge number of climates in recent years. And the focus we're taking in thinking about infectious diseases is very much on the aspect of disruption of our health systems. And this can be really corrosive because so many of our health interventions have a kind of sell-by date. You need to come back and keep repeating your interventions to keep things at particular levels. For routine programs of vaccination, for efforts to eliminate malaria, we could be losing ground that we would just not be able to make up. This is from Benny Rice, who's seen right there as field site, which was just supposed to be a study of malaria, but turned into a study of how cyclones affect malaria. This is in Madagascar. And every single cyclone season, there was a devastating cyclone which took out every possibility of preventing malaria infections in the population. So something we see a lot in this country, unfortunately. This is an earlier cyclone, whose name I forget. And you also see a lot of travel away. So we have a lot of mobile phone call data records. You can see that people move in the path of the cyclone. And as forced migrations happen, of course, there are opportunities for diseases to spread. I think that the human systems aspect is very natural to think of health systems, health support falling apart. Another piece which perhaps we think about less often is that pathogens have, plants have pathogens too, and the spread of plant pathogens could also be shifting and is in fact shifting within a changing climate. We're doing some work on this. This is Kinan Dugal, who works in the lab, looking at flax rust in the Rocky Mountains. This is not a high stakes infection at the moment, but it's one that's very easy to study. So you can actually pick out the pustules and see how this enormous climate gradient pushes around their transmission. And this, I think, is something that we need to understand better. We're beginning to sort of probe in terms of what that means for agricultural systems. I've told you about biological limits. I told you about health systems. There are also dynamical effects. So if we take a very simple schematic, the susceptible, infected, recovered model, which following the pandemic, I think everyone probably has heard of, it's just the simplest model of an infection in the world, where you start off susceptible, you become infected as a function of transmission, and then you recover. I spoke about the fact that climate drivers can shape that transition from susceptible to infected. It can also modulate how good we are at delivering care, such as vaccines. But the final piece is that it can shape the dynamic. So it could change how frequently you get outbreaks, whether they're every year or every other year, how deep the troughs are. And just as, the more sort of dramatic climate effects, which leads to, vast losses of life, might be the things that first draw our attention. It's these little shifts in when and where cases happen during the year that might be, harder to guard against and might just lead to the disclosure of high mortality. So, for example, this is work by Rachel Baker. Respiratory syncytial virus, which is the leading cause of mortality, I believe, in under fires in the United States, has a very clear climate gradient across the country. And if you pull this together to do the detective work to figure out how transmission works and how temperature and humidity shape transmission, and we did an analysis of vast time series available from across the United States and Mexico, you find that if you predict into the future, what you get is a kind of flattening out of the time series in certain settings. And so you won't get so many cases around Christmas, but you will, on the other hand, have cases throughout the year, for which health systems might not be prepared, right? They're designed in ways to meet surges. They might not have the capacity to meet a very different time signature. Another way in which dynamical effects can play out, this is work by Maya Chang, also sitting here, is that just the climate system has, in some sense, a year-to-year memory. Typically, we get the sequence where El Niños are followed by La Niñas, and then the neutral year, and then an El Niño. So you have this sort of built-in memory. And disease also has a memory, right? The infections reduces the number of susceptible individuals. So what happened last year will shape what happens the next year. And you put these two together, you can end up with these stored-up climate effects that might be predictable, something we're working on at the moment, but also could shape where the burden happens over the course of times in ways that could have serious implications for how health systems should meet these challenges. And finally, so I talked about biological systems, health systems, dynamical effects. There is the big question of pathogen evolution. So shallower troughs in annual fluctuations, right? And usually influenza has a big outbreak around Christmas and then goes to very, very low levels. In fact, we think it basically goes extinct in most parts of the world during the summers. But if temperatures change, those troughs might increase, and that means more pathogen diversity will get through that trough. And so you have a challenge if you're trying to design a vaccine to meet the circulating influenza virus, right? And this is something we're not great at the moment. If we were to get worse, influenza is one of the really big killers, we could be in an even worse situation. To echo something that Charles said as well, you know, where this happens is also going to be where the people are, right? It's a combination of the climate events that favor the circulation of the pathogen, but also where the highest density of individuals are. And that will tend to be in the places where the diseases have the biggest impact. Okay, so these 4 effects, and just to end with one last piece, which is that, you know, obviously, in order to understand this, we need huge time series to be able to grapple with how the climate drivers shape the transmission of infections. We have the luxury of an animal model for basically influenza in the context of directly transmitted infections. For the rest, it's this kind of unsatisfactory detective work, regressions, amongst other things, informed regressions. So clearly we need this information, but there's another thing that we need as well. So you may remember in the spring of 2020, people started saying coronaviruses are winter pathogens. Obviously, this thing will go away in the summer. We can relax. This is something that Rachel Baker was uncertain about, who was a member of the group. And so she looked across a spectrum of different relationships with specific humidity and transmission for influenza and also known other coronaviruses. And she modeled a huge spectrum of these possible relationships, going from the most extreme at the bottom to the lowest. And what you find if you do that, if you put that together, is a susceptible infected map. So this is starting at 100% of the population being susceptible on the x-axis there at the right, and the infected are on the y-axis. So first of all, you get this huge outbreak. And it doesn't matter when the seasonal forcing is happening, because everybody in the world was susceptible. And eventually you settle down onto this attractor where you have an outbreak every year. But for the first start of the pandemic, what we expected was very little seasonal signature, because everybody was susceptible. And this is why we think that, you know, the real missing piece you need to understand and pull apart these pieces is a sense of who is and isn't vulnerable to infectious diseases, a measurement of our immune status. So these are the 4 pieces, and just as I end, I want to shout out to the Climate Disease Group at Princeton, which is Dave Becky, myself, and Brian Grenfell, with Associate Research Scholars Benny Rice, Jamie Caldwell, and Rachel Baker, although she's now a professor, and Maya Chung and Polly Burrows are students, and Keenan Dugal is the Research Associate. So thank you.
I'll invite our panelists to face the audience, and I'll be collecting questions. So it's our tradition at OPR to first let our graduate students or postdoctoral fellows to ask a question. So if any of you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll also be following the online participants. Yeah. Lauren?
I have a question for Jessica about the ways in which all these different factors that you talked about may interact in the future to create compound hazards in the epidemiological space. Do you have any insights that you might be able to share about the ways in which, through novel pathogens being introduced from that don't behave in the same ways that have, combined with things like changes in temperature and human mobility, might stress healthcare systems, or is that something that you think is a lower probability event compared to what we have now?
I think there will be another and I think it is hard to predict exactly how and when. Every previous pathogen event surprises in some way. But what I do think we can start doing now is developing case for how climate drivers push around infectious diseases. There do seem to be a lot of commonalities. We see the same base pattern in influenza and RSV and coronaviruses. There's another group, the enterovirus, that seems to be summer pathogens going on there. The vectors, you know, they're in. I think it would be wonderful to be prepared to be able to anticipate these pieces. Interactions, sure. I mean, I think that as something Michael said, of the increasing pace of disruptions is something that when inevitably, you lose your routine measles vaccination programs. A cyclone comes through, there's a massive malaria outbreak, and then it also measles. These pathways of measles go up. Yeah.
Machine?
Yeah, thank you so much for the great panel discussion. I mean, like, I have a question for Chagler. Sorry, how do you pronounce it? Chagler. Sorry. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. Also, this noon as well. I totally echo your like when you talked about how much we just don't know about, like, you know, you can never measure whether those migrants are migrating due to climate change, because like we don't have data on what they would do otherwise. I'm just like, I guess my question would be like, given that and all those kind of other uncertainty like that other panelists also mentioned, is it like even feasible? Like, or is it even necessary to try to put a surveillance on the, you know, the dimension or the extent that people are migrating with respect to climate changes?
I'm not exactly clear about the question, but let me say the following. So we live in a world of limited mobility, right? Only depending on how you measure it, and how the person of the world's people are migrants. And this is arising from both mobility costs, that physical or financial costs, as well as the policy restrictions in higher. This is a big country, it can accommodate quite a bit more people, but we decided we're not going to take more people, even if we need it, even though the markets are telling us 13 to 15 million undocumented migrants. We obviously need them in the labor markets, but we need both. So the one way actually to reducing when you have a climate event, there's a big climate event, I'm much more interested in how it affects the welfare. Right? It can affect the economic welfare, but it can also lead to increased mortality. Okay? So actually, one way of thinking about it, if we have increased migration today, economic migration, especially the high-income countries, were to allow more legal entry pathways for relatively low-skilled people, for the jobs we are already using in construction and agriculture. So I think it will significantly reduce the negative impact of climate change when it happens, because it provides an adaptation. Okay? It doesn't completely get rid of it, but it will help in terms of the adaptation. Okay? I think what we try to say in the WDR, don't think of migration as an outcome, negative outcome. It obviously impacts the destination country residents, some of them, right? But on the other hand, it benefits a whole bunch of others. And once we do it under our own terms, right, where we have the flexibility and we will have the flexibility, it will enable us to adapt and respond and actually big climate events happening much more.
I will sneak in a question here. So almost all of you talked about this uncertainty being the major issue. We don't know what climate scenario we'll end up on. We also don't know how we will adapt. Both are uncertain. And it makes it difficult for us to communicate whatever we're researching or writing or thinking about on the one hand. And on the other hand, Michael talked about this, maybe Çağlar also talked about this a little bit. There's a lack of resources, there's a lack of political will when it comes to dealing with this issue. How do we deal with this state of affairs? How do we communicate emerging scientific knowledge so that it also becomes convincing to change things around?
You know, you should keep in mind that there are success stories in the past of long-term planning in the face of real or perceived risks, which led human beings to actually transform the way they were addressing this problem or that problem. I mean, the classic one that's always mentioned is the constructive warfare systems in this and other countries in the face of cholera epidemic. And those were huge construction projects that went on for decades, that in some ways are still going on, but where ways were found to do the planning, to do the financing, despite the fact that there was a lot of ignorance about the scientific specificities. We make those kinds of long-term big money commitments all the time on the national security front. I don't think that human beings are incapable of doing it in the climate context. I just think that today the situation is a mess, and that we will have to learn how to belly up to the bar and clean it up. And that means transforming the governance systems. But that has been done. It's the story of our political systems. They are not always frozen the way they might look from today's perspective in a lot of places. So it's not like I personally am pessimistic. I just think that, you know, the sooner we get on it, the better, or else we're going to be in deeper and deeper trouble. It's a deeper hole to dig ourselves out of, and it kills people.
I'd say one story of the last few years has been many more policymakers coming to understand how much. And while a lot of them still shadow it's also the case that there are many fewer people in those positions who use uncertainty as seriously as I would like, other people like problem there, but almost anyone you talk to in any position, I'm not sure. And I don't think that was nearly as true a decade ago, certainly to sort of afford to so much future. Talk about this. So I think that part of that battle, like communication battle, the other side of things over the same period, entered into a period in which investment of the kind that Mike was talking about is much more expensive. And so a lot of things that might have seemed quite manageable at the level, the American federal policymaker, I think one of the real stories of the next half decade is going to be how we redesign our some semblance of these kinds of investments for themselves. So there are real challenges there. But some of like communications. Time financial system.
I mean, one of the questions, who's the we? In one vision, things happen on a well-distributed basis. We take care of our needs and their needs. In another view, probably the more realistic, we're terribly selfish about the whole thing. And, something has to be done to figure that out as well. It's a complicated story. We can no longer, India, we're going to tell them how fast they can cut their emissions. And at the same time, we're going to say, you can worry about the damage yourself. That isn't going to work. So that's another aspect of the political deal that has to be done.
Yeah, I think about some of these issues with regard to COVID, and it's a kind of a cultural political case study that isn't realistic, because I think the numbers turn out to be realistic. But in the middle of or early 2021, the IMF said that it would cost $9 billion to vaccinate the whole world and eradicate COVID. And they estimated that the payback to that $9 billion investment was going to be something like $20 trillion by the end of the decade. It was like, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was like more than 100-fold return on your investment within a decade. And the initial starting cost was like not very high. And there was no serious policy discussion about that anywhere in the world. And even though the returns to, if the US shouldered that cost entirely on themselves to vaccinate the entire world, totally putting aside the diplomatic gains and the cultural gains you get from that, just raw economic returns inside the United States would have been larger than the initial rollout of that estimated. And yeah, there was no serious efforts to consider it anywhere in the world. And it's hard for me to look at that story and think, optimistically about the way that we relate to those suffering world. Climate change is going to teach us a little bit about our common humanity and change the way that we think about these things. But this is the other direction are just as large, and that's pretty great.
I feel like a lot of this is talking actually with some pictures of the heroic era of the into smallpox, and it's estimated that the US recoups its investment on it every days or something. It's a vast investment. I think that I'm not sure what the chances of eliminating COVID were just smallpox is a very particular vaccine, infection and vaccine. So I think that those conversations with everyone will try to do partly with the pathogen in play. But the fact that like Michael was saying, I gain heart from the fact that these things have happened. It's huge investments.
What this phrase reminds me that we faced down the ozone depletion problem, even though we had in the US, we had a tremendously conservative anti-regulatory administration at the time, because somebody did a cost-benefit analysis. And showed that it wasn't even close. And the US could act on its own and reap a big benefit, even though it couldn't completely solve the problem on its own. It's analogous, because most of the savings were the lifetime savings over decades, and yet we faced it down. Now, it wasn't a big industry; it was a $30 billion industry, no big deal. The $30 billion in the late 1980s was a big deal, and we did it anyway. So there are these success stories. It's just trying to imagine it in a coordinated fashion, happening across a whole number of countries at once, across a whole different spectrum of risks, all tied together by climate, and then the other risks that aren't. It's mind-boggling, but it has to be done.
I'll give one anecdote. September 1st was my 20th anniversary at the World Bank, so I got to go watch. But it made me remember this at our orientation. This guy came, named Robin Malkan. He was the one of these legendary vice president of the bank. He was from Ghana, spent lived in trenches doing really calculations. And he comes. At the time, he was the vice president for MENA, Middle East. We hire the best and the brightest. You're going to do all this technical analysis. You're going to run your regressions. You're going to talk to the politicians. It's not going to work. If you want the Argentinians to do something, all you have to do is tell them the Chileans have done it. So it actually works. So which countries have successfully done? Look at Colombia. They took in all these Venezuelans and it didn't work. Right? Look at Turkey. It was a whole bunch of other problems. But despite all those problems, 4 million refugees in Turkey. And if you take the control for the same income level and population ratio, that comes around 40 million people. Perfectly nice. Those are successful. On the standing side with the and on the high income country, what Germany has done, you just have to, I think, wait for 4 or 5 more years, maybe a decade, and they to climate change, but in terms of migration outcome, what the Germans have done and how they changed the whole mindset and blocks the party, regardless of which party is in power, that letting in people and whether they're refugees and this because they need that. They changed the mindset, they retooled the whole bureaucracy, the education system, the labor market system, the legal system. And we just have to go tell the Italians, you better stop and look at the Germans. I think that's what works surprisingly well.
Well, also, Germany came out of a particular history where they had learned the lesson of political polarization, paid the price. The US, for instance, has never really paid the price. I hope we don't have to.
Okay.
So, so looking at, there's a lot in Chagler's plots that were very interesting. I have to download and read this report. Yeah, I'll download some of the little spider downloaded a lot of that. So one of the things that I'm wondering is with regards to the title of this session, how will it change the population? I saw in your maps, many of the places where there are big migrations are not tied to climate, right? I know what's happening in Venezuela has nothing to do with that, right? And many of the other places also. How do we see climate now and climate in the future being distinct? And is it relevant that climate be treated distinctly from these other drivers of migration, or can we treat them all as different flavors of earthquakes? I'm curious. Yeah, as a climate scientist, I'm self-interested for you to tell me that yes, we matter, but I'll take whatever answer.
I'll quickly respond to that. I mean, I talked more about this in the presentation in the morning. The typical migrant today in the world is I said this, apology for the repetition, but middle income countries, because those middle income countries, Mexico, Philippines, Tunisia, have the education system and the close proximity to the high income destinations so that it was easy for people to go. But the rapid demographic change in these middle income countries, declining fertility, means you don't have the excess population. That will mean the demands of the labor markets in high income countries. On the contrary, these guys are going to become destinations. So the only excess labor force you have are going to be in those low income countries, which are also impacted by the climate change. Right? So again, looking backwards and historical trends, especially since the Second World War, is not really going to help us in this regard. That ship has sailed, right? Fertility in India is now slightly different. In 20 years' time, you're not going to have 25-year-old Indians really linking their and 45%. The market will take care of this. So that's where we are. I don't know that. I know the correlation. But the challenge we have is the causation coverage.
So let me give my own version of an answer to that. I work in the migration space a little bit. I've been lucky. Rachel Baker was my graduate student, and she fled. I tried to get her to work on migration, but she fled to disease. Sexier problem, sort of, or an easier problem. But anyway, and I have Rachel Young is here. She works in this dimension also right now, but she hasn't fled yet. Maybe after getting a degree.
I can help as well.
So, you know, what I think, the modeling of migration in a future-looking sense is not yet ready for prime time because of the process issue. But, you know, like everything else, there'll be improvement over time. And what I can anticipate the day will come when we'll be able to say with some confidence, it's, you know, forget about these projections of global migration due to climate change. They're not useful, especially not now. But what might happen in particular regions, locations, borders, for instance, at particular times, I think we'll get there and we will be able to make projections that are useful. It just hasn't happened yet. We'll get there.
Yes.
All of you talked about models and modeling in your presentations, and you talked about kind of the narrative power of models, and some of the models that you might, like LASA and think are like less useful at seeing. I'm also an economics student and a climate activist, and I know my future profession has whipped pretty badly on the modeling of the climate crisis. So I wanted to ask you, what are some models that you would be interested in seeing, or that you think are some of the best models, the most interesting models, or interesting approaches to modeling?
I just went to the meeting at the Gates Foundation. We were funding this vaccine modeling initiative, and the program officer said, "So you should really name the model." And Brian Grenfell said, we never name them because we might be curious. And I think, right? I mean, based on the mechanism behind it, that truism all models are wrong, some models are useful, actually that it's also true. It's so true. And there is, like I tend to the center end of the scale, that's I'm like climate scientist. So there is a way in which, in my world, there's occasionally walkthroughs with really complicated Asian-based modeling. And I think like George Fox again, he said the thing about a really complicated model is that once you've built it, you have two things you don't understand the world and your model. So I like a simpler model, but that's as far as I can.
Just to add to that, in my research group, we do 4 or 5 different types of models. And it's for us, it's a scale. So models that are based models that are relatively small scale. There are these, for example, economic models that are big, useful and insightful at a larger scale. And now we're sort of struggling, well, how do you put this stuff together so you can make what's done at each scale inform what's done at another scale? But that's the answer I have.
What I would say, which models not to use. So, by the way, almost 10 years ago, Gene Grossman, who's the economics department, spent a sabbatical in my unit. So we talked about, I said, what is the, how you generally produce amazing scholars? And he said, you don't tell them what not to work, where they would be wasting their time. So, but I can say, I demonstrate, especially generations slightly older than the English competition, general delivery models. They're completely useless because the kind of the input-output mechanisms are completely mechanical, right? They do not incorporate behavioral adaptation. Where one of the best examples of virtual behavior adapts to the economic environment. Like those models, as if they take the numbers and then they think analysis, you change one of the parameters and look at how everything kind of takes care of it. I think those are completely mistaken because you can actually tweak it in such a way. I see a lot of people at the World Bank deal with this. Is the result that the politician wants to justify the
Okay, so we're out of time, but Michael, you said when it comes to future projections, it's all about your personal disposition. There's no logical argument. So I want to ask each one of you, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Optimistic, but then again, I don't have to believe it.
I've grown more optimistic over the last few years, but it's off of a pretty high baseline of pessimism, so I'm okay.
I'm not, and I think they're wiring so
I think I'm also optimistic. States, democracy is the worst regime, except if all the others. And I think humans at one way or another, in most cases, can figure out a solution until we try everything else and it doesn't work. And I mean, it's an existential that I am not willing to give into that message. We have a teacher.
So I want to thank all our panelists and also Sani Mojola for supporting thinking of this panel. So thank you all for being here.
I needed a second. No.